Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
Preparation and recovery. And my name is Alan Nazaro, and if I hope you're in the right session. This training was developed by Rural Community Assistance Corporation, and it actually is a 3-hour training that I do for housing counseling agencies, but it's adaptable to any housing agency and practically any agency, nonprofit agency that works with housing or other community development services. And basically that's what I've done. So I have been with RCAC for 4.5 years now. And before RCAC, I worked for FEMA in community recovery assistance for over 7 years and worked all over the country helping communities to recover from devastating disasters, presidentially declared disasters. And so I have a lot of experience with community recovery and FEMA programs, and we're going to talk about a lot of that kind of stuff. Because of my FEMA background, when I first started at RCAC, the first project, and I started in the housing division as a development specialist. But because of my work with FEMA, the first project that I was put on was the campfire recovery in Paradise, California, to help with the housing recovery there. And we'll talk about that, but that was a pretty devastating event. And we'll give you some statistics on that and some of the things that they went through. So after that, I realized that RCAC has a lot of the same disciplines that FEMA puts into the field to help communities after a disaster. And I went to management and said that if we had a coordinating mechanism, that we could probably do some of the same things for our rural client communities, rural and indigenous client communities. And so we did a report for management. They took it to the board. The board, at the time, seeing all the disasters that were happening throughout the West, and I forgot to mention, I don't know, do you all know RCAC? Rural Community Assistance Corporation. We service the 13 Western states, Colorado being the most eastern, where I'm from. And we also service the Pacific Islands. I've been out in Guam helping with recovery from a typhoon out there. So RCAC is a CDFI. We have a housing division that has several components to it, development assistance or development solutions, and we run the self-help program in the western portion of the country for USDA, and we have housing counseling. We do housing counseling training for HUD, which, as I said, I do the disaster recovery component of that, which is required now by HUD because of all the disasters that are occurring. So we also do economic development and a lot of community development stuff, training and TA and leadership and capacity building. So we have a wide scope of things that we do to help our client communities. So the board asked us to put a business plan together, and they put in money. They liked the business plan, and they put money into this new program, which we now call Community Resilience and Disaster Planning. And they realized that rural and indigenous communities were disproportionately being impacted by disasters and emergencies and had the least capacity and resources to respond or recover. So that's why the board unanimously approved the program and threw some money at it to get it started. We're doing work in Mexico, California, Guam, and we're going to start helping some tribal entities with hazard mitigation planning, which is a big thing that we're concentrating on now, because as you'll see, mitigation is really an important. I was in the insurance session yesterday, and the idea of mitigating properties against wildfire or other hazards can help you with your insurance in most cases, if the insurance companies are wise. But we know they're not always wise. So today you'll gain a foundational knowledge of disasters, the types of hazards, and the disaster cycle. Um, discover what an agency and the staff can do immediately following an emergency, and identify resources for response and recovery stages. And some tips on housing counseling for disaster survivors, and understanding the basics of how agencies prepare for disasters or emergencies through planning and continuity of operations plans. How many of you know what those are? And how many of your agencies have those? I only see one hand up for having it. Those are really important, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about preparation and mitigation lessons from Paradise. If we can get through all this, I'm going to have to talk fast because there's a lot of slides. This is the agenda, the basics for hazards and disasters, disaster prep for your agency and your staff and your clients, and housing counseling services that can help survivors after. There's a lot more that can be done for homeowners than renters, but renters also need to have knowledge and plans in place. So, and then lessons learned. Basics. A disaster can occur over a short or long period of time, and a major disaster causes widespread human, material, economic, and environmental loss. There are naturally occurring weather events which become major disasters when they encounter human civilization. And, uh, you know, for instance, a Category 5 hurricane out in the Atlantic Ocean, if it stays out in the Atlantic Ocean, it's not a disaster. But once it makes landfall or comes close, then it starts to interact with human civilization and can become very dangerous. And once it makes landfall, as you've seen, it causes incredible damage. But simply, a hazard is something that can cause harm. And according to the UN, natural hazards are environmental phenomena that have the potential to impact societies and the human environment. And if left unmitigated, we're unprepared for them, then they can be very destructive when they do impact the human environment. And these are some of the natural hazards that you'll encounter, and you really should prepare for whatever natural hazards are prevalent in the area that you are working or living in. These are human-caused hazards. And can you think of any other human-caused hazards? And I'll go back to my previous slide. Wildland and urban fires are most often caused by humans. In California recently, there was the Park Fire, and it was a crazy person who set a car on fire and rolled it down a hill into a ravine during a drought. And it started a mega fire in California that destroyed a lot of property. And we'll talk about this later, but it didn't destroy enough structures for it to be a presidentially declared disaster, even though it caused a lot of damage to a lot of property, most of it being forest land. The red line is 2023, and you can see it's far above the other lines. And it marks the 9th consecutive year in which 10 or more separate billion-dollar disasters have occurred in the US. From between 1980 and 2023, which is the black line, the average number of billion-dollar events was in the area of 8.1, 8.3 per year. In the last 5 years, it's been close to 20 events per year. And this year, as of July, the middle of July, there were $15 billion events. And with things still happening, this could be a record year in terms of the number of billion-dollar events. For those of you who like numbers, severe storms are the most frequent of events that happen, but tropical cyclones and hurricanes are the most destructive. They cause the most damage in terms of dollars. And you can see it's almost 2.7 trillion with a T dollars since 1980 that have in damage in the United States. And this is what happens if you're not prepared. We had a saying in FEMA that all disasters begin and end locally. The local community, the local government gets impacted first. And when their resources are exceeded, they go to the county or the state. And when their resources are exceeded, the governor declares an emergency and asks for assistance from the federal government. And then FEMA advises the president whether the disaster reaches the level that is sufficient based on numbers to have a presidentially declared major disaster. And we'll discuss how that happens in more detail. These are the primary local entities that work together in emergency if the communities have the capacity to staff them or are large enough to have all or even many of them. You know, as I said earlier, rural communities often lack adequate capacity, as you know, and population size to have all of these staff. And these are also the communities that are disproportionately impacted. In a lot of cases, the damage, if there's not enough property damaged in a certain area, then FEMA won't have a presidentially declared disaster. And then it falls upon the local community, the counties, and the states to do the disaster recovery for those if there's no declaration. There is some funding that can be had from the federal government, but not a lot. The presidential declaration opens up a lot of different possibilities. These are the state activated agencies in a disaster for the vast majority of states across the country. Again, if they have the capacity. And these, in a presidentially declared disaster, all federal agencies are on alert, but the ones listed here, there's about 17, are the ones that are mobilized in one form or another to assist. You know, we'll start to talk about preparation, but think about this. How can your agency ensure coordination happens with major parties involved prior to a disaster? Any ideas? Right. But how do you do that? Right. Correct. Very good. Yes. All of that is correct. I mean, communication, research, and outreach are important steps in accomplishing preparation. You need to know who your partners and who your go-to entities are for disaster or emergencies when they occur in your communities or your areas. If you aren't prepared, you can't respond to a disaster. So planning, organizing, and training are important starting points for local communities, agencies, and clients. If if your clients don't know what to do when an emergency occurs, they could end up being victims rather than survivors. So keep that in mind. Response includes immediate effort actions for life safety and to protect property and meet basic human needs. This kind of stuff is most effectively done by trained and equipped emergency management agencies at the local, county, state, or federal level, depending on the severity of the disaster or emergency. Disaster recovery encompasses both short and long-term efforts for rebuilding and revitalization of affected communities or organizations. And how well you recover depends upon how prepared you were for disasters or emergencies and how you respond, and if you mitigated against any of the impacts prior to the event. Also, if your community or organization has structures and systems in place prior to the disaster to begin the recovery cycle as quickly as possible after the disaster. When I left FEMA a few years ago, they were getting very involved with pre-disaster disaster recovery planning, trying to help communities identify systems and procedures and organizations that could work together in recovery as soon as the disaster, the life safety issues are resolved, then the disaster recovery should begin. This we euphemistically referred to as a three-hump camel when I was at FEMA, and this is the basic idea of the disaster cycle. Preparedness is ongoing. When you learn lessons from a disaster, you can better prepare for the next one. But the short term, the life safety and response comes in days and weeks. The intermediate is weeks and months. And then, as you can see, that long green hump at the end is recovery. It starts during the short term. I have been deployed to a disaster by FEMA like 2 or 3 days after the disaster hits to start to identify what it's going to take to recover. So recovery is almost as ongoing as preparedness, and it's long term. There's we always used to say recovery is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and that's true. And it takes years or decades, depending upon the severity of the disaster. I worked on Katrina years ago, and the population in New Orleans has never reached what it was prior to Katrina. They've recovered a lot, but the population, because people were scattered to the four winds. Yeah, that was pretty devastating. And the three areas that you should concentrate your efforts are preparedness prior to the disaster, mitigation before and after the disaster, to reduce the future risk and impact, and then recovery, and planning both pre and post disaster. If you can establish those systems, like I said, then you're ahead of the game. And mitigation efforts make your organization and community more resilient and less susceptible to devastating impact of major disasters. When I worked for FEMA, they're constantly doing studies, and back before I left, they were saying that for every dollar you put into mitigation, you save $6 in recovery, which is a great ROI. But today, that number has jumped to $13 saved for every dollar you put into mitigation. So it's only getting worse, especially because of climate change. The number and severity of the disasters has really stepped up. So this is the declaration process, like I said, if the local resources are exceeded, the state responds, and the governor decides when to declare an emergency for the state. And when the state resources are exceeded, then they request federal assistance. And as I said earlier, FEMA advises the president on the severity of the disaster and if the criteria are met. And there has to be a certain number of residential structures destroyed and other structures and other property damage in order to meet that criteria. And then the president will decide to declare a major disaster. In certain cases, and I think this happened in Katrina, if it's so obvious that the disaster is, the damage is so prevalent, the president can make the declaration on his own without advice from FEMA or looking at the numbers. And tribes, as sovereign nations, can go directly to the federal government, or they can go through the state for declarations. All right, here's where we get into the nitty gritty. A disaster resilient agency identifies vulnerabilities and takes action to mitigate those vulnerabilities. They have response and recovery plans in place. They identify resources on hand and the gaps needed to be filled and where those resources can be obtained for what's needed. If your agency isn't resilient, then your clients won't be either. Physical damage, your office or facilities are damaged or inaccessible. And I don't know if everyone in this room realizes it, but nonprofits are eligible for FEMA public assistance grants to help with facility rebuilds. And if you lose equipment in your office or things like that. So you really should investigate that and make sure you know how to apply for those grants. Staff capacity. Staff, maybe disaster survivors lacking shelter and transportation. So your staffing levels could be down after an emergency or a disaster. And you gotta, make sure that's where a COOP plan, continuity of operations plan, becomes so important, to make sure that you can operate at a minimum level for your business. And clients also may be disaster survivors, and they may have compounding service needs, for BIPOC and lower income residents. They often have issues prior to a disaster, and then a disaster only exacerbates those issues. So you need to plan on how you will respond to each of these component parts to help them. How will your agency respond in an emergency? Who will have what responsibilities? How will your agency continue to provide services during and after an emergency? Is your staff ready to respond or assume COOP duties? And we'll talk about that. HUD has a lot of really good information, and so does FEMA about continuity of operation plan. Ready.gov is a website where you can get access and more detail on these. I apologize that some of these slides you will not be able to read because they came from HUD and there's just too much information. But I will send the PDFs to Housing Oregon, and you can at least look at them. And just remember the websites, because that's where all the detailed information is. In order to have a good COOP plan, you have to do a business impact analysis to identify the time-sensitive or critical business functions and processes and resources that support them. Recovery strategies are alternate means to restore business operations to a minimum acceptable level following a business disruption. and are prioritized by the recovery time objectives developed during the business impact analysis, which is really important to do. Plan development is where you begin to scope uh, uh, the scope, the objectives, and assumptions for continuity of operations. This is where the rubber meets the road, where your organization, where you organize your COOP team, and you begin to delegate authority and identify the lines of authority, succession of management, and the interaction of outside organizations as well as clientele. And I realize that for some organizations, you might not have a lot of capacity to have this, but do the best that you can with what you have and try to figure out how you can keep your business going. And testing and exercising is always the way to ensure that the COOP plan will work when needed. Your partners are local EM folks. In cities, there's an emergency management agency. Most counties have them. Smaller towns may not. So depending on if you're urban or rural, you might look to the city or the county. You need to get to know those people because they're the ones with the knowledge and experience. And there's NGOs that who do disaster work and have a lot of resources available to help. United Methodists, the Mennonites. There's just all these different NGOs, national NGOs that come out for major disasters and help with recovery. And then, of course, there's a lot of resources available through FEMA and other federal agencies and state agencies to help with preparation and planning. In California, we have the California Office of Emergency Management or Emergency Services, and most of FEMA's funding flows through those state emergency management services agencies. And so it's good to get to know them because they're for planning purposes, and you can get preparedness planning money through FEMA through your state emergency management service. Risk assessment is a process to identify potential hazards and analyze what could happen if the hazard occurs and turns to a disaster. Again, this helps identify the vulnerabilities for your organization and community that, if mitigated, could lessen the impact of the hazards. One key to having a great response plan is opening lines of communication and developing relationships with public emergency services. And as I said, these local professionals know the community, have knowledge and experience with the hazards, and the community is facing, and are the first responders to help when a hazard occurs. So life safety is always the first priority when a hazard occurs. And as stated, different scalable responses are needed for hazards that differ in intensity, frequency, and the size of impact. Those are the things that determine what the response is going to be. And procedures should be made public, made specific to the threat imposed by the different hazards anticipated. Like I said, if you are in a wildland urban interface, WUI, that also happens to be on a fault line, then you should be prepared for earthquakes and wildfires. In coastal areas, it's sea rise and heavy storms off of the coast. These items apply to organizations and individuals, especially remote employees. These are key documents, and a big thing that organizations need to do is have backup, offsite backup. I worked a disaster in Oswego, New York. There was flooding, and the town had all of their paper records in the basement of the town hall. which flooded. And restoring paper records is expensive and difficult and not always possible. So having offsite digital backup is really recommended for everyone. You need to create an emergency response plan for your agency and your staff. This information is true for the emergency response plan, and after you develop a continuity of operations plan, promote staff readiness with emergency response and COOP plan training. You need to recognize what you know and what you don't know about emergencies and emergency planning. And like I said, that ready.gov site has a lot of detailed information that can show you, and then you have to start filling in the gaps. An agency is only as effective as its staff, as I'm sure you know. So personal emergency kits can be the difference between being able to respond or being in need of assistance. So again, ready.gov, they have information about these kind of go kits. And they really can be a lifesaver, and they staff should have them in the office and they should have them at home. The agency should supply the ones in the office. And also the staff should have emergency plans for their families at home. And we'll talk about that. And also remember that family and personal needs come first. So be aware of what's going on personally to help avoid burnout by staff that are stressed and by an emergency, and also worrying about their clients and their work. And I mentioned this earlier, nonprofits are eligible for FEMA public assistance and other programs. So be sure to investigate what resources are available through the federal disaster programs. And there's a website for that as well. I mentioned United Methodist, but Catholic Charities is a strong member of the National Voluntary Agencies Active in Organizations Active in Disasters, VOADs. Has anyone heard that term before? I know there's a VOAD, state VOAD here in Oregon, and you should really get to know those folks because they're the ones that organize and activate NGOs to help in disasters. And the national VOAD, provides a forum for cooperation, communication, coordination, collaboration, and effective disaster delivery of services for communities affected by disasters. And they also advocate for communities with the federal government. And these NGOs often help FEMA form long-term recovery groups after a disaster in a community. And these long-term recovery groups take in, with the help of the national and state foundations, take in donations and voluntary workers and to help disaster survivors. And they have what they call an unmet needs roundtable, where people can come with a case manager and request assistance for things like that may not be covered by the federal government, some lost furniture that wasn't covered by insurance or federal government, or things that just slip through the cracks and a lot can slip through the cracks when you see the small amount of assistance that FEMA gives individuals and families. Okay, a little knowledge check. Which of the following sets best determine the type of immediate response after an incident? Any guesses? Close. I mentioned this. It's A, the type of disaster and characteristics of the event, how far flung it is, the magnitude, the strength and amount of damage, and the scope. Okay, NOAA and FEMA are sources for information on the history of severe hazards and disasters in your area, region, and state. FEMA, Red Cross, VOAS, local and state government could also be listed as partners here, but you should try to, when you're doing your emergency plan, try to fill in these boxes with the partners in your area that will help you after an event. In addition to discussing the severity and frequency of disasters, there's a need, there needs to be discussion about the potential for disruption or shutdown of a local organization. Your partners are everyone listed in the previous slide and notes, plus your employees, your vendors, your suppliers, your regulators, even clients, anyone who would be impacted and necessary for restarting operations. Okay, disaster preparedness for clients. And a lot of this is for homeowners, but renters have need for all of this stuff too, especially this go bag idea. Your clients should have that as well, because having enough supply to last at least 3 days away from home can mean the difference literally between life and death for a client or survivor. So, and ready.gov again has all the information about what is needed for these go bags and how to keep them up to date because things do expire. So there's information there. If your clients don't stay safe, they potentially might not be around for you to assist after the disaster. So this survival kit is really important, and having a plan for their home and their family. Oh, yes.
Apartment I'm living now, I can't have a prepared bag. There's no place for it. So what do you do in that case? Like I said, less than 500 square feet. I got no place for a preparedness bag. I used to, but not now. What do you say to people like me who have no place to put that preparedness bag?
Well, I mean that go bag, especially for an individual, is not that big. And I would just say, yeah, right, right.
Less than 500 square foot apartment.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, I would find a place, either your car, clean out a closet. I mean, I know that well, right. Well, I wish I had a better answer for you. um, I when I worked in the town of Vail, Colorado, I had a tiny, what should have been a studio apartment, but was, and there were nooks and corners that I couldn't even use, but I could have stored a small bag there. So I don't know. it just, yeah, that's a tough question. And, but it also talks about planning, because you need to plan what you're going to do in the event of a disaster. And if you have family, where are you going to, where are you going to meet? What's your go-to location to hook up? And especially if, you know, a husband's at work, kids are at school, where's your go-to meeting place, and how do you get back together? And you have to plan, and then a plan is only as good as what you do to practice it. And um, you know, my family had a location right outside on the cul-de-sac outside our house. We're across the street on the trail where we would meet if the house were on fire. And we had other ideas about if the kids were at school and my wife and I were at work, how we would hook up. So it's really important to do that for clients. This slide's information offers excellent advice for being financially prepared for disaster and is available on the HUD Exchange website. There's a lot of good information on HUD website for, they've been building up their disaster recovery and disaster preparedness information for years on the HUD website, and they have a lot of good information there. And you'll see, like I said yesterday, we were talking about insurance for multifamily getting out of control as far as price goes. And in a recovery, having adequate insurance is the key to a more complete recovery. You know, there's excellent information here on the FEMA website about insurance guidance and how to be best prepared for a disaster and your most important documentation. A lot of people don't even know what's in their insurance policies, and especially if you're managing properties, you need to know what's covered. That was brought up yesterday over and over again, that there are certain things that may be excluded from insurance policies that you're not aware of, but you should be. So going over insurance policies, because as you'll see here, FEMA expects property insurance to be the biggest piece of the puzzle for recovery. I was talking about this earlier. If you're in the earthquake area, most homeowner policies do not cover earthquakes. So if you're in an earthquake area, you need earthquake insurance. The same holds true for flood. Flood insurance is outside of homeowner policies. If you have a flood from burst pipes, your homeowner policy or your property policy will cover that. But if it's from a natural event, it's not covered unless you have flood insurance. And FEMA has the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP. They support that, or they subsidize that, and it's bought through regular insurance companies that offer it. And a lot of banks and realtors will tell homeowners that if they're outside of the 100-year floodplain, that they don't need flood insurance. It's not required. That's true, it's not required, but if you get a 500-year flood or a 1,000-year flood and you don't have it, then you're going to be SOL when it comes to your property. You know, adequate amounts of insurance can make the recovery a lot easier. And I know that's difficult with the price of insurance these days, and that's something we're working on in Paradise. I've been working there for 4 years now, and we're doing a lot to mitigate the town of Paradise against wildfires, because a lot of insurance companies won't even insure in Paradise, and the ones that do have raised their rates. That's happening a lot in California, Florida, Louisiana, all these different states. I'm not sure. I know it's prices are high here in Oregon, and I'm pretty sure some insurance companies have probably left or aren't issuing policies here as well. Is that true? Do you know? Yeah. And a lot of people don't realize that, FEMA assistance cannot fully replace or restore what has been lost in a disaster. The maximum FEMA grant for individual or family assistance is around $35,000. And if you get temporary housing in a hotel or rental unit immediately after a disaster that's paid by FEMA, that money will come out of that 35,000. And the average grant is a lot lower than 35,000. Not a lot of people get the max. So FEMA is not going to make anyone whole. And FEMA, like I said earlier, is going to want to know what your insurance is covering, and then they'll fill in some of the gaps, but their resources are very limited. So, adequate insurance coverage is very important to fully recover from a disaster. And in flood-prone areas, a combination of property insurance and flood insurance is necessary. Because as I mentioned, they're mutually exclusive. When I was in Louisiana for Katrina, there were insurance agents bickering over whether it was wind and rain damage or flood damage that caused some property damage, so that they didn't have to pay, the other guy had to pay. So it's really mutually exclusive. So you and your clients, if you're working with homeowners, or even renters for renters insurance, they need to carefully check their policies to ensure what the insurance does and does not cover, and what the limits of that coverage are. This is a very important step, since all federal assistance is predicated upon, the insurance being paid out to cover the majority of the homes. So, and this is a service that housing agencies and housing counseling agencies can really help with. In a lot of disasters, FEMA will through the Health and Human Services agency, that will give money, and FEMA will do grants for case managers to help survivors. But if you can help your clients, I've been in situations in disasters where case managers that were funded by FEMA had caseloads of over 200 people. And so it was a hard slog for them to get through that and to help those people. But if people can be helped with filing insurance claims and claims for, FEMA assistance, that really can move the recovery along. And I mentioned the United Methodists and Mennonites. They actually send out people who estimate property damage after a disaster. So, and the cost of rebuilding. So this type of assistance is, again, usually given through the VOADs at the state level, or the LTRGs, who are organizing volunteer efforts. You need to plan ahead. There's a quote I like: preparation is half the battle. Nothing is lost by being on one's guard. For I know by experience that I have enemies both visible and invisible, and I know not where, when, nor what, from what quarter, nor at what time, nor what shape they will encounter me. That's Don Quixote. So you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what's coming unless you look at what hazards are prevalent in your area and prepare for them. And communication is the key to any successful plan. So it's really important that everyone be on board and know what their responsibilities are. And again, there's going to be a lot of repetition in this presentation, but this excellent website has tons of useful information and guidance. If nothing else, take away the idea of where to go for all this information on these websites. And, you know, emergency preparedness planning is a step-by-step process, beginning with the risk assessment. You can't plan for what you don't know may be coming. And that was the point of that quote. Take advantage of the expertise offered locally by the local emergency managers who are acutely aware of the threats that they face, that face their communities they serve, and take advantage of the knowledge and work with them on your planning. Every emergency management agency usually has a hazard mitigation plan that's approved by FEMA. And what you want to make sure that your preparedness plan and other plans are taken into account. And those hazard mitigation plans identify all the risks that are prevalent in their area. So if there's a county or a city that has that plan, then you can readily find out what your property is facing. And you want to involve everyone in your planning and make sure they know how things work and who has what responsibility and what their specific roles are. And that's important for buy-in and execution when the time comes. Once you have an idea of the risks, there are many resources available through FEMA and other agencies to help reduce the risk through preparation and planning. And like I said, you can even get funding through FEMA to do preparedness planning, working through the state emergency management services. The Disaster Assistance Improvement Program was created in 2006 by executive order, and it was supposed to improve survivor access to information and make applying for assistance easier. A lot of people will tell you that it's not an easy process, and FEMA repeatedly denies claims and then has people reapply and reapply until they finally get what they're needed. The site lists over 76 programs from 17 federal agencies that directly assist survivors, like FEMA's interim housing program, or tools to help address changes for Social Security, for example. Or if your house or apartment are destroyed, how do you get your mail? You know, it's a very helpful website for anyone with access to the internet. Post-disaster, unfortunately, depending upon the severity of the impact, internet access isn't always available to survivors, at least immediately and sometimes for weeks. So after a disaster. So, and as you all know, lower income survivors often lack internet access. So, which makes agency assistance for clients critical. And, you know, when I was in Louisiana for flooding in Tangipahoa Parish, there was an SBDC office that was the only place where internet was available after the floods. And businesses and residents, they flocked there and they let everyone use their internet to file claims or check with their suppliers or vendors. They were an oasis in literally a sea of water. For those with internet access, the information here is very helpful and specific to each different event that occurs, declared event. They will have a lot of information about the programs and the application process. Everything from helping an individual determine which program meet their needs to application forms and instruction are available. Communities can even find resources about recovery. It's a very extensive amount of information, and it's an interactive site. So, yeah, realizing the importance of technology, many communities with previous disaster experience will attempt to have internet access available to survivors through undamaged public facilities or even within designed shelters, designated shelters, and assist survivors with accessing assistance. And like I was talking about, the LTRG case managers assigned to help survivors seeking assistance to recover from these also perform this function for their clients, which is, again, if you can work with your clients, that helps everyone. There's a tremendous amount of disaster-related information cataloged on this site, so it's a really important site to remember. And local governments often set up a disaster information website and or information centers to assist the residents impacted by the disaster. Another key source of assistance and volunteers are the VOADs that I mentioned earlier. Red Cross, Salvation Army, United Methodists, all come in after a major disaster. And these national entities, these are national entities, but they're often state affiliate or local chapters. And most counties and even multi-county regions impacted by disasters set up these long-term recovery groups to work with survivors to assist with unmet needs, the gap between the insurance and what the government will pay. Depending on the severity and expanse of the disaster, and I've seen this all over the country, housing becomes an extremely significant issue, especially in remote rural areas where it was a crisis before. The disaster just exacerbates it. You know, I mentioned Katrina in 2011. Same thing happened in Minot, North Dakota, flooding in 2011, where Minot is a town of about 40,000 people, and it's in the middle of nowhere. You drive up from Bismarck, North Dakota, and you come up this hill and you go down, all of a sudden there's a city. And it's about 100 miles from the Canadian border, and they had horrific floods. They lost 4,000 to 7,000 homes, and their central business district was decimated. Hotels were flooded. So people had no place to stay, even on a temporary basis. So people were commuting 90 minutes in one direction to live and to come back to work. So, you know, when stuff like that happens, it's just really hard for people to get their lives back together, and they need all the help they can get. So housing is a huge issue, and HUD and FEMA often work together to find available rental units to put people in. So again, networking with your local agencies and county and state agencies. I'm not sure, I think Oregon has a disaster housing task force, and those are the people that work even between disasters to figure out these kinds of issues and have an inventory of available housing for temporary situations. FEMA is the main coordinating agency for federal agencies in a presidentially declared disaster, and the state emergency management agencies are the main coordinating agency for the state response to a gubernatorial declaration of an emergency. If and when the disaster at the state level receives the declaration from the president, the state's EM agency works side by side with FEMA, and FEMA will defer to the state on issues because they know their local communities. And so they are, the state emergency management people are really good to get to know. The Red Cross mission is to meet immediate disaster cause needs for individuals and families and community, especially mass sheltering, FEMA will work with Red Cross to set up shelters for people immediately after a disaster if they've been displaced. Salvation Army is best known for two key services: mobile food service and donation management. And I've seen in a lot of situations that United Way will act for LTRGs as the financial manager for grants and donations that come into an area as well. Individual assistance, as I mentioned, they call it individual assistance, but it's for families too. It's not the answer to everyone's recovery issues. And on the contrary, it's a very small piece of the puzzle. And I said the maximum grant is about $35,000 and it goes towards everything. And by the time you're ready to rebuild, there isn't much left. Public assistance helps reimburse local governments for debris removal, safety, and other assorted expenses during the response, but the process can be really grueling. And it's also used to restore public facilities and infrastructure. So depending on how much is allocated and available, but it's really a difficult process. In that same Oswego disaster that I worked on, the town had hired engineers to examine and assess the damages that to all public facilities, including the schools. And they came up with a number, and the public assistance people working in the field agreed with them, and they put in the applications. But FEMA headquarters sent out what I can only describe as a hit team to reassess those damages. And they came out so much later that they were saying that the flood levels were lower than what was being claimed, but they never saw the original height of the flood. So, and it took senatorial intervention to get them to back down. It was a mess, and it got very public. HUD is the primary agency for housing recovery in the National Disaster Recovery Framework. FEMA coordinates, and USDA supports, especially for rural communities. FHA has a variety of disaster-related resources to assist homeowners. And if you work with homeowners or property owners, then you should familiarize your organization should familiarize yourselves with the requirements and limitations of the program. CDBG-DR is like, are you all familiar with CDBG? Well, yeah, CDBG-DR is like CDBG, is the most flexible funding source that the federal government has. It can be used to match FEMA grants. It can be by the local governments or mitigation grants, because if you get a mitigation grant to strengthen your home after a disaster, you have to pay, the homeowner or the property owner has to pay 25%. But that CDBG-DR can be used for that match. So it's really flexible. And there's other waivers within each CDBG-DR allocation has its own, for each disaster or each disaster year, has its own waivers. And they're often more flexible than regular CDBG. Yes. Yeah, I mean, normally if there's a really big disaster, Congress will allocate money because it's in the headlines. Or if there's a series of disasters, they'll allocate a good portion of money. And then within the law, they'll say which disaster gets how much and even which areas get how much of that grant. It's never really enough to fully help recover, but it's one of the biggest sources. And this dysfunctional Congress that we have right now hasn't funded FEMA's regular emergency funding, and they haven't done CDBG-DR since 2022. The National Low Income Housing Coalition has been trying for years to get Congress to make CDBG-DR an annual program with an upfront appropriation, which can be amended to, if more money is needed. But they haven't been successful yet. And they have a law that is being proposed, but under the current circumstances, it's not going anywhere. But it is a good program when and if they have it available. This is one of the more complicated programs that should be reviewed in greater detail by your organizations to better understand. I don't understand it, and I won't even pretend to tell you about it. So FHA has their own language. There's really good information here and resources and guidance on this page. USDA, in my experience, has always been a very active partner with FEMA in disasters for rural communities, especially for agricultural industry. And the Rural Development Division has a good deal of rural housing programs that are either disaster related or can be applicable for rebuilding, especially for low income and senior residents. So you really, the 504 and 502 programs at USDA can really be useful in disaster recovery. These programs don't sound very impactful, but can be very useful. Even though it sounds strange to think about SBA loan for disaster recovery, SBA loans for survivors are low interest, extremely low interest rate. They're like 1 to 2%. They may be a little higher now because of the situation, but they are extremely low and below market. The only issue with SBA is that you have to have gold leaf credit in order to get an SBA loan. So it's difficult, and they have a lot of denials. One of my staff worked for SBA and worked hard to get those denials turned around after a disaster. Okay, another knowledge check. Disaster recovery normally starts when the first responders, fire, police, search and rescue go home. Is this true or false? You are correct. It is false. It starts really soon after a disaster hits. Okay, from 1980 to 2023, which disaster type had the greatest number of events? Greatest number of events. That was on the one slide. Hurricanes and tropical storms cause the most damage, but severe storms, freezing storms, rainstorms, all kinds of storms happen more often. And this can happen after a disaster. These are your friends. Don't be afraid to engage with them. It could be crucial for clients and help your organization. FEMA can be daunting, and dealing with mortgage and insurance is difficult at best. Renters and landlords, private landlords, not nonprofit, but private landlords have even less resources. I don't know if you're aware of this, but FEMA does not assist businesses at all. In Paradise, there were over 30 mobile home parks in the town that served as affordable housing. They were mostly devastated and wiped out, but they were privately owned, so there was no FEMA assistance for any of those owners. And to this day, there's maybe a half dozen that have come back, and they've come back bought out by market rate people concerns. So they lost a lot of good affordable housing there. And a lot of the housing that has been built early on, it was built right after COVID. And so the cost was extremely high. So those are, I think, the highest number of homes on the market and selling in Paradise or being built are over 500,000. So it's really difficult. Some builders are building affordable, but it's going to be a while before the affordability comes back to that town. And you know, the LTRGs and the NGOs and the FEMA funded case managers are, you know, they really work hard and try to help people with those unmet needs, which are plentiful after a disaster. So it's always good to get to know them and to interact with them if you can help your clients or to help you help your clients. And like I said, in most disasters, the case manager grants go to the either a large NGO or through the LTRGs, and they work with the LTRGs to do those unmet needs. And so there's a thing for FEMA and HUD called duplication of benefits. HUD and FEMA will not pay for something that somebody else is paying for, like insurance, or HUD pays for something and FEMA won't. So it's really good to coordinate with all these groups so that you don't have any duplication of benefits and that people receive all the benefits that they can to recover from a disaster. In addition to the important functions covered previously, any medical issues need to be covered. Medications, EpiPens, list of prescriptions are really important and should be compiled, especially for senior citizens who may have multiple needs. Have a checklist of all items needed for the go bag and update and ensure expiration dates are checked regularly. I've seen so many times in mass shelters where seniors had to evacuate quickly and didn't grab their medications. If they don't have a list of what they are, they can't get refilled. So that's really important. And it should be part of the go bag. Earthquake insurance isn't required by law, but earthquakes aren't covered by property insurance. And so, as I said, if you live in an area of seismic activity, it may be worth looking into earthquake insurance to protect your property and personal belongings from quake damage. And the same goes for flood insurance. We talked about that. A lot of this is repetitive because you need to know these things. They need to sink in and be second nature to you when you are looking at these issues. And you know, with climate change, 500 and 1,000-year floods. And does everyone understand what those mean? The 100-year flood and a 500-year. 100-year flood just means that it's a probability. There's a 1 in 100 chance that a flood will be that extensive. For 500, there's a 1 in a 500 chance that the flood will be that bad, and so on. So you can have a 100-year flood every year if the weather conditions are right, or a 500-year or a 1,000-year flood. It's not how many years between the event, it's the extent of the event and the probability of it happening. But with climate change, they're happening more often. Is an emergency plan in place for the family of a client? Where will they meet? How will they contact each other? What if they are at home or school, like I said earlier? Who's responsible for making sure the go bag is ready and who's responsible for physical custody of it, and have they practiced the plan? These are things that need to be done pre-disaster. These are critical items to consider. Many people that have been through a major disaster haven't been through a major disaster and aren't aware of the difficulties of accomplishing these tasks. Not to mention the hassle of applying for government assistance in time of disaster, which is a brutal process and with repeated denials, as I said, and the need for appeals to go through, and insurance company claims processes can be even worse, as I'm sure you're aware. You need to know what you don't know before a disaster hits and get training on the programs that will help your clients. And the same idea applies here, getting training for programs you don't know. Some general topics in these areas can be taught in a group level if there's no PI involved. And once again, these are crucial items that many people will have difficulties in accomplishing. Most people have not had to deal with the hassles of applying for government assistance in times of disaster, which is a brutal process. And HUD and FEMA offer a wide variety of training opportunities for organizations and individuals. Research them and obtain the training for your staff, your organization, and your clients. A devastating disaster will require some expertise in all of these areas for recovery to be truly effective. Clients' families are overwhelmed by the disaster, but then go through the daunting process of recovery. They need guidance and hand-holding assistance throughout. It truly takes a village of experts to pitch in. And that's it. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot. I was going to mention Paradise. Are you all familiar with what happened with Paradise? It was a town of 26,000, of which a lot were retirees, and all of which were on septic systems with public water system. There were 38 mobile home parks, and a majority of properties were built over many decades before the 90s. They had an emergency response plan identified evacuation routes, but didn't plan on the speed of this windswept fire that hit the town. It was nearly wiped out. 85 people died. 80% of all homes were destroyed, and over 90% of the manufactured housing units were decimated. The only hospital in town was rendered unusable, and a large percentage of the businesses were damaged or destroyed as well. The high fatality was due to the fact that the town developed over a long period of time with no zoning or planning, and there were long dead-end streets. Most of the people that died lived on those long dead-end streets. But the town, they really reacted well in terms of trying to mitigate what happened to their community. They looked at all the problems that they had and they addressed them. Do you know IBHS, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety? They came up with what they call wildfire prepared home standards, that if you build your home to that standard or prepare your home with that standard, then you're going to be better mitigated against wildfire. And it's nothing, and I'll go over it, but it's not really expensive, and it's some things that are easy to do. They adopted property maintenance standards to make sure that there aren't a lot of dead weeds on properties. They're working with who we're working with now too, the Paradise Recreation and Parks District, which is a regional district, to do buffer zones around the town to slow down fire as it approaches the town. And they're implementing a centralized sewer system connecting regionally to the city of Chico down the hill. And this will give them the ability to do wildfire informed development where they put their most dense development in the areas served by the sewer and uh, the development away from the edge of the ridge. The town of Paradise sits on a 1,000-foot ridge above Chico, and the fire came up the ridge edges on both sides, and that's why it was so devastating. So that'll help them in the future, and they're also not planning on building back to 26,000 so that they can have more open space and irrigated properties. There was an orchard on the east side of the town, which the main fire came from. Everything on the east side of the orchard burned to the ground, but everything on the west side was untouched because the orchard was irrigated and was a green space between the fire and those other buildings. So they're going to try to implement more of those maintained spaces that offer refuge and fire breaks. Let me just talk a second about those wildfire prepared home standards. If you have a fire resistant roof, which even asphalt shingles can be, or steel, or that kind of non-combustible. And if you have an important part is having at least a 5-foot perimeter around your main building that is non-combustible material, either stone or rock or just not plants. So it really is important about how you landscape immediately close to your building. And then not having, maintaining, all the other landscaping on the property so that it's not susceptible to wildfire. And by doing those things and all of the programs, policies, and projects that the town's implementing, they're going to reduce their wildfire risk by 75%. And hopefully we can convince the insurance companies that doing that will make them able to give insurance to people at a reasonable rate. The only thing is that insurance companies want to see more than just one community, so we have to spread the word. And I mentioned this in a meeting with the Oregon insurance commissioner, that mitigation should be top of mind for the whole state, and that's the only way you're going to get insurance companies to get on board with knowing that the state is safer and insurable. So that's my story. Thank you. Any questions at all?
I was curious, just with your experience, kind of getting to the question of that before, a lot of, especially smaller apartment communities have a community building or common area with the go bags. It's like best if it's right there immediately in your apartment, but you think that having that located in a more central communal area, it's organized in a way that effective too? Or?
Well, if you have if you have a good enough plan for dispersing them and getting them to the people, and then their plan has to coincide with your plan. So yeah, so if you have a plan for the property and involve the renters, then yeah, that's a possibility. Yeah, that's a good idea.